Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, and I'll be giving you all a much needed update on these polls. We've gotten a number of polls even in just the past 48 hours, and today we'll be focusing on the Rust Belt. But before we get into the Rust Belt, we're going to talk first about the national polls, which have seen a movement towards Kamala Harris in the week and a half that it's been since the first and potentially only presidential debate of 2024. So on the day of the debate, if we go back to September 10th, Kamala Harris is up by 2.5. She's now up, as we can see, if it'll let me go here, by 3.3. So she's gone up around 0.8, 0.9% since the day of the debate. You'll notice that she's getting close to 50% nationally. She's at 48.5, so rounded up, she's at 49. And she's really making progress here because generally speaking, winning presidential candidates in the polls on election day, they're at 49, they're at 50% of the vote. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like Donald Trump in 2016, where he was only polling around 44, 45% nationally. But again, that, him winning in 2016 was the only election of the past 10 where national polling did not predict the winner correctly. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind national polls do tend to be predictive on election day, even if they are very, very far from perfect. So Kamala Harris, the fact that she's ahead in the national polls, that her lead is growing, that's a good sign for her. But obviously, in the United States, we don't elect presidents by a national popular vote. We care about the system that we all know and love or hate, and we call that a system, the Electoral College. And in the Electoral College, as I think is the consensus at this point, Kamala Harris has essentially locked up 226 electoral votes. Donald Trump has locked up 219. There are conversations that can be had about some states on the fringe, like maybe Texas and Florida for Trump. Maybe for Harris, that could be Virginia or Minnesota. But at this point in time, based on what we know, there are 7 states that are going to decide this election, and we are going to watch them all very closely. But today we're going to talk about the Rust Belt, which are these 3 states. And these states are so important because if Kamala Harris wins all of them, she's the president. Donald Trump, however, he can win the Rust Belt and he cannot be the president if he loses these other 4 states. Now, obviously, if he does win the Rust Belt, he's very likely winning at least 3 of these other 4 states. But, just to entertain the possibility of him winning the Rust Belt and losing, in theory, it's possible, but it's very unlikely given the fact that these 3 Rust Belt states are polling more favorably for Kamala Harris than any of these 4 Sun Belt states, and Nevada being the sole exception, where Nevada and Pennsylvania are pretty similar in terms of the polls, but Pennsylvania is still bluer than Nevada. So if you believe the polls, if these states go red, the entire South, or the entire, collection of these 4 southern states has already gone red. So let's talk about the polls. Quinnipiac released polls yesterday afternoon, and they were very good for Kamala Harris. In Pennsylvania, she was up by 6. She was up by 6 in arguably the most important state of this election. In Michigan, she was up by 5, which is also huge. And then in Wisconsin, potentially the tipping point state, she was up by 1, which is a smaller margin. So let's go through it. I would say both the Pennsylvania and Michigan polls are very good for Kamala Harris. Why? Well, because these are 5 and 6 point leads, and even if you consider a potential polling miss, Kamala Harris still holds up here. So when we talk about the polling miss, we have to understand that the polls have, both times Donald Trump ran for president, they've underestimated him in the Rust Belt. And in 2016, he was down in all 3 of these Rust Belt states. He won all 3 of them. In 2020, he was down by 7 in Wisconsin, 8 in Michigan, and 5 in Pennsylvania. And he lost all these states by very slim amounts. He lost Michigan by 3, he lost Pennsylvania by 1, and he lost Wisconsin by 0.6 of a percentage point. So we know Donald Trump in these 3 states across 2 elections is 6 of 6 in outperforming his polls, and he could very well do that again. The problem, though, this time is that there's not a huge reason to believe there will be a polling miss to the scale that we saw in 2016 or 2020. In 2016, the polling miss was caused because polls were not waiting for education. They were getting samples that were fairly representative of the electorate based on race, gender, age, but they were not waiting for education. So they saw that in their polls, educated white voters were much more likely to respond than non-college educated white voters. And those non-college educated white voters were very favorable to Trump on election day, even though they weren't responding to polls. While educated white voters were, kind of a mixed bag, and they actually trended towards Hillary Clinton relative to 2012. So that was why you saw the white vote in all 3 of these Rust Belt states. That is why you saw it in the 2016 polls be a lot more favorable to Hillary Clinton than the actual result on election day. And so that essentially created the 2016 Rust Belt polling miss. And by the way, that's why the same polling miss didn't really exist in Arizona or Georgia or Nevada, where Hillary Clinton actually outperformed her polls or matched them, right? Was because you didn't have the same level of undersampling of non-college educated white voters the way you did in the Midwest. And then in 2020, the polls were wrong everywhere. The polls were wrong in Nevada. They were wrong in Arizona. They were wrong in North Carolina. They were not wrong in Georgia, to be fair, but they were wrong in 67 swing states by pretty significant amounts. And that was because you had, obviously, white college-educated voters being way overestimated for Biden. White college-educated voters were in the polls a lot more favorable to Biden than they ended up being on election day. And more importantly, we had a huge response bias because Democrats were more likely to be at home because of the pandemic. We saw in 2020, based off of polling, that Democrats or people voting for Joe Biden were more concerned about the health effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, were more likely to be staying at home and picking up maybe their landline or having the time to respond to a poll, while Republicans or Trump voters were more likely to not be, staying at home. And obviously, in the fall of 2020, we didn't have stay-at-home orders in many of these swing states, but we did have a lot of restrictions on what you could and could not do. And Republicans were more likely to not, I don't want to say not be following restrictions, but more likely to be, I'd say, less conservative, no pun intended, with how they went about their lives in the midst of that pandemic. And so that is why we had a huge response bias in 2020. This year, we don't really have that. Polls have started to wait for education. We don't really have a huge response bias. And, obviously the argument has been that there is a response. There was a response bias for Kamala Harris immediately after she came into the race because Democrats got super energized all of a sudden. But that has kind of subsided, and we've seen in polls that have released their crosstabs, we've seen the response bias kind of cool down to kind of go back to equilibrium where it should be. And so what that means is that we don't have any signs of real polling miss. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that every poll is going to be accurate. I'm not saying that you should look at the polls and just assume that they're 100% going to be right, because that will almost always fail you, especially in the Midwest where polls have been bad election after election. What I will say, though, is that I'm not going to assume the polls will underestimate Trump just because they've done that the past two times. In 2022, in Wisconsin, Democrats were losing in the governor's race in the polls by 0.2%. They won that race. They were down in the Senate race by almost 6%. They came within a point of winning that race. In Michigan, the governor's race was I think, a 5-point lead for them. They won it by double that. In the Pennsylvania Senate race, I think the most infamous example, Republicans led by a point on election day. They lost by 5. So in these states, 2022, we saw Democrats beat their polls. And again, that's evidence that the polling miss doesn't go the same way every time. So that was a very long-winded explanation. I hope you stayed with me there. But again, in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, when I see a 5 or 6 point lead for Kamala Harris, unambiguously that is good for her. She's at or exceeding half the vote here. Jill Stein's still taking 2% of the vote away from her in Michigan, and she's still up by a good amount, well outside the margin of error. Now, Wisconsin, this is a tricky one because Wisconsin, she's only up by 1. She's not close to 50. And again, I don't want to use past polling misses to predict future polling misses because the factors that causes polling misses will change every election. But unlike in Michigan or Pennsylvania, Wisconsin is the one state where I do think you can make the case for Harris still being overestimated in the polls. That's because if we look at how these states are voting, Wisconsin is voting out of line the most. So what do I mean by that? Well, historically, the states have voted like this. Michigan is the bluest, Pennsylvania is kind of in the middle, and Wisconsin's the reddest. And in 2016, that was true, and in 2020, that was true. And in the 2022 House vote, I believe that was true to an extent. I think it was Michigan, Pennsylvania, then Wisconsin from bluest to reddest. So for the past 8-10 years, it's kind of been the norm. But in the polls, if we look at how these states are voting, just to kind of show you all very quickly here, Michigan, Harris is up by 2.5. In Pennsylvania, she is up by 1.9. And then in Wisconsin, interestingly enough, she's up by 2.7. So she's up by the most in Wisconsin when usually, Democrats do the worst there of these 3 states. So I believe that you could, realistically see a polling miss that favors Trump in Wisconsin just because of that. And that's why I think this Quinnipiac poll is not necessarily best news for Harris. It's good for her because she has a lead, but it's not the best either. So based on that, I would say that I think she should still be cautious about Wisconsin. But the good news for her is that if she wins Michigan, Pennsylvania, In Wisconsin, she's at 270. And even if she doesn't win Wisconsin, let's say she loses it, if she wins one of North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, she wins the election. So Quinnipiac, unambiguously good polling for Democrats, good polls for Kamala Harris. And if we look at the other Wisconsin polls, we've seen similar things. AARP, Fabrizio, Lee, and Impact, they had Harris up by 1, and then when they pushed undecideds, when they didn't push undecided, she was up by 3. When they pushed them, she was up by 1. We saw Redfield had her up by 3. Morning Consult had her up by 3. Marquette, Gold Standard of Wisconsin polling, had her up by 4. So she's up, by low single digits in all these polls. And that makes me feel a bit more confident about her, predicting her to win here as of right now. And so that's where we're at, right? Like, this election is very close. I believe that this is, I think, without retrospect, because obviously after the election, everyone's going to, talk about how obvious it was that X or Y candidate was going to win. But to be intellectually honest, I think this is the closest election prior to the fact since 2004. I think in 2016, you could have made the case that it was close, but I do think that in 2016, there were better arguments to be made for either Trump or Hillary Clinton than I think a lot of people realized. And obviously 2008, 2012, and to an extent 2020, I think it was pretty clear who was favored to win. This year, I can make 25 good arguments for Trump. I can make 25 good arguments for Harris. What matters, though, is that right now in these states, Kamala Harris has the momentum. She's up by a point more nationally than she was a week ago. She is doing better in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And those are the 3 states that she needs to win this election. So let me know what you all think. Tell me who you expect to win this election in the comments down below. Tell me who you think is going to win these 3 states. I want to hear it from you. Right now, if you had to pick in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Pennsylvania, who would you take? Let me know. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you all in the next one.